identify your name and the organization.
My name is Azlan Adnan, Green Party of Malaysia. I'm trying very hard to understand something that hasn't been discussed yet. So I hope the panelists can help me dissect and unpack the drivers of American foreign policy, which to me appears to be very paranoid, adversarial, and even antagonistic. Does it go back to 9/11 or even further to Pearl Harbor, or what Roosevelt said, you know, this is the military-industrial complex that's driving American foreign policy? America has never fought battles on its, or wars on its own soil. The theater of operations has always been somewhere else, proxies war, destroy somebody else's country, and, or does it go back even further to the Monroe Doctrine? So maybe Stephanie can shed some light on that. Thanks.
Okay, well, that's a big question. Second, any other hands? I saw one. Any other questions? No? While waiting, we probably have time for one more round. Maybe I can start with Stephanie and we can go on here. Origins of American foreign policy, and maybe what drives it, and then maybe focus more on the foreign policy aspects that are most relevant to Asia and ASEAN.
Very tough question. I definitely welcome this perspective, and I'm sure I also appreciate the characterization you made of showing how American foreign policy is being seen right now, or can be seen from the region. I think as with any country's foreign policy, there are going to be a lot of origins for that drive specific elements of it, whether it's at the international structural level, the fact that there has been a lot of perceptions of unipolarity since the 1990s, which have maybe been threatened by the rise of China and these narratives, both based on China's objectively growing economic and military power, and also based on perceptions and how people actually think about that. And so maybe to get into the idea of how those perceptions are created, we can also look at domestic factors and also even bureaucratic or individual level leadership factors, which obviously are going to vary across US presidential administrations and even across different ministries within the US government. So that will be my maybe unsatisfying, very overarching view of this. But one thing I'll kind of link back to is perhaps Professor Quick's remarks about what would drive Malaysia, for example, to think that they should go to balancing or bandwagoning. Maybe if China is the only major power remaining, or if China acts so aggressively as to cause alarm and to make hedging perhaps more of a riskier strategy than the others. And I think we can look at both the capabilities and the intentions that are being seen in China, and to some extent, I guess this is out of the region, but in Russia, Europe, and other parts of the world, as also driving American foreign policy across these. And perhaps if there are more specific elements of the policy that we want to get into, we can discuss the more concrete drivers for those as well.
Thanks very much, Saudara Asa. And to answer Asa's question, and also taking the cue from Kim Ming, would be U.S. foreign policy clearly involve a wide scope. So let's focus on Asia and particularly on China-related issues. I completely agree with what Stephanie has explained. Her answer very much is about structural driver. You asked about what drives U.S. foreign policy. So I think a structural driver will always be there, especially bearing in mind that the US is the unipolar power in the post-colonial era. And as a unipolar power, you would want to naturally, if you put yourself in their shoes, naturally it's human nature. You try to preserve your primacy for as long as possible. And because of that, we have this so-called Thucydides threat, saying, describing, if not predicting, the relationship between the number one power, established power, and the rising power. So US-China has been described within that so-called Thucydides threat. So I think you can have your own interpretation and conclusion, maybe other than Graham Allison and also Kevin Roth. But I would just, in addition to what Stephanie has emphasized, I think there are clearly also domestic drivers, domestic factors, and there are multiple. You highlighted about the military industrial complex. That's certainly one big element. But there are also other aspects, for example, the election cycle and also the bipartisan interactions. I think in relation to US-China policy, what is so clear is that by the time of Trump and continue until Biden, the bipartisan consensus towards China is that the US has to be tough vis-a-vis China for a number of reasons. Not just because of the power dynamics, the structural dynamics, but also because of the ideological value differences with what is going on in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and also, and now more recently about Taiwan. So there are multiple elements at work and explain why impossible for President Biden to stop Speaker Pelosi to visit Taiwan, especially during this election year. I will stop here.
I think just to add on what Stephanie and Chen Chu have said, from my personal observation, the US foreign policy has been not as active as it was before during the Cold War and predecessor towards that. So what we are seeing is that after the Cold War has ended, the US foreign policy is more toward reacting onto new dynamics and new threats in the region, and that is also why China is already in advance in the Asia, and the US foreign policy is more towards reacting on the Chinese advancements in Asia. But what particularly interesting with the current Biden administration, when we see that China and US as an autocracy against democracy, then we can clearly perhaps understand if the US foreign policy perceived China as an actor of autocracy, and that is actually a threat to US, which is a democratic nation, then I think the foreign policy is a bit, in my humble opinion, it is a bit misguided, because we could not see the US-China rivalry is a debate or is a conflict between autocracy and democracy. It's simply a rivalry of an ascending superpower that wants to be at the top of the layer, and how does this superpower interact is more important. But again, what I think, since the Cold War has ended, I think the US foreign policy is a bit not very clear and not very robust, and it's just on reacting onto the dynamics that's happening in the country, as what both of the panelists have mentioned, as well as external dynamics which involve China.
It goes all the way here.
Yeah, I think Ching Chui as well as Dr. Zokri has answered one of the questions pertaining to the conflict between US and China. Is it ideological or is it something else? And I think there are elements of both in there.